You study forest ecology, and specifically how plants compete with each other for resources like water and light. If a friend who had never heard about and thought about forests, how would you explain what you do in 1 to 2 sentences?
Yeah, excellent question, co-physiologist. What that means is that I am very passionate about plants. I study plants, specifically how they interact with their chemical, biological environment. I study processes such as the water movement and water uptake capacity of plants, photosynthesis, and how these processes actually can help a plant to cope with stresses, drought, or competition. And this can also help us to understand what might actually happen to our plant communities, climate change, or other anthropogenic impacts disrupt our forest communities. Yeah.
Hmm.
And specifically, I'm very passionate about climbing plants. So yeah, I think these are wonderful objects in our natural forest and they are largely overlooked.
Yeah. I was going to talk a little more about plants with this next question. You've made lianas, which are woody climbing vines that wrap around tropical trees, a big part of your research career. What's it about that's really intriguing to you, and why do you think everyone should know a little bit more about them?
They're wonderful organisms. They do different things than trees. A lot of ecologists look at a forest and they mainly see trees. Well, a forest consists of a lot of more organisms than just trees. And one of these very unique organisms that are very important for our ecosystem. Very short, what is a liana? Has its own system in the soil that allows it to compete with, for instance, other trees and plants, and then uses the structure of the tree to climb up into the canopy. So it's not building a lot of structural support itself, but relies on its environment to use to climb up into the canopy, right? And once in the canopy, it will distribute its leaves on top of the trees. And so you can imagine if you put all these leaves on top of trees, you deprive these hosts of lights. A tree needs light for growing. So what we see is that lianas have a very big impact on the forest structure and the forest well-being because they compete very strongly with trees. The growth of the trees goes down. Lianas have the ability to actually increase the mortality of a tree and reduce the reproductive capacity of our trees. So if lianas increase, which is actually what we're observing globally, this can have a tremendous impact on our forest because the capacity of our forest to take up CO2 is actually reduced because these trees are experiencing a negative impact of these lianas, not allowing them to perform to their maximum capacity. And that's why I think lianas are very important from a climate perspective, but also from a biological perspective, they're just fascinating. They do things differently than trees. They do other things than trees, and so they compete in a very different way, or sometimes similar. And I think that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, so upon a little bit more that when far tropical forests get more, what particularly happens to their ability to store carbon? Is this a feedback loop that people are not aware of? What actually is happening there?
So the thing with lianas is that the research on lianas has only slowly over the last 20 years since we actually observed that they are increasing, they compete for nutrients, for water, and for light. And so they have a big impact on our trees. And by this competition, these trees, as I said before, they are unable to take as much carbon as they normally would. So this storage capacity of our forest is actually reduced. What now happens is that a feedback loop, more lianas, less storage, more CO2 in the atmosphere, meaning more lianas. And so we can get a runaway effect, researched in more detail. But it's definitely something to be worried about. This is something we have to figure out because these are processes that are now. It's very important to understand what the overall effect of lianas would be on the tropical forest.
Yeah. So you've done field work in places like French Guiana, where you actually climb through forest, you measure water. Surprised you the first time you did that kind of serious tropical field work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm always fascinated by the tropical forest. I'm originally from Belgium, where we don't have a lot of forest, especially in the part where I live, where everything is grassland and farmland. Fieldwork in the tropics was always a kind of a passion project, if you want. And yeah, it's really wonderful. It's a very different ecosystem. Quite overwhelming to see a forest that stretches as far as you can see with this very intriguing animal life that I'm not used to. So it's very unique to do some research there. There's a lot of heat, there's a high humidity. We had a lot of snakes in the field, for instance. But this makes it really fascinating to do. I'm very privileged to actually do research there. I would recommend it to everybody. I really enjoyed it doing field work there. Yeah.
Yeah, so you also run the Invasive Species Collaborative at Virginia Tech, which is separate from your Liana work. Why do invasive species in particular matter to you, and does it connect to your tropical forest research?
Yeah, so I'm one of the faculty members that's affiliated to the Invasive Species Collaborative, which is a great initiative by Virginia Tech. So why is my research invasive species? Because a lot of the very persistent invasive species here in the United States are lianas. We have Oriental bittersweet. A lot of you might know kudzu, which is very aggressive vines that are taking over the forest here in the United States. In general, invasive species can cause a lot of trouble, and my research on lianas can actually help us to understand, all right, what makes specific forests sensitive or very prone to becoming infested by these very aggressive vines, and are there ways we can help our forests to cope with these stresses?
Yeah, so I've actually recently interviewed a bunch of scientists who study the Amazon, particularly from the outside, deforestation, the soy, the cattle, the dark earths in the Amazon, but your work goes a little bit in the other direction, as in studying what's happening inside of the forest that we haven't really cut down yet. From where you stand and your researches, are the parts of the Amazon and the tropical forests we still have, are they actually intact or are they being changed in ways that we don't really see or haven't quantified yet?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Yeah. A lot of the issues that we created as human beings are a global phenomena. So the forest is not spared from that. So the impact of increased CO2 does indeed have an impact on the communities. There's shifts in the communities that we're experiencing. This is probably the biggest threat, ecosystem, the water transport through this ecosystem, interconnected system. So from the moment we start to pull on specific threats, we often do not really know what's going to happen. The forest is pretty resilient, but of course, there's only so much kind of stresses that a forest will cope with. Yeah. So one of the things what we see with these lianas is that they're increasing, but also that there's these entire patches in the forest that are completely dominated by lianas, and the trees are not able to actually poke through these mats of lianas anymore. And this appear more that is something related to climate change itself, and that is an anthropogenic stressor. Yeah.
Yeah, so on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most urgent, how worried should the average person be about these changes that are happening inside, from your research standpoint, inside these tropical forests over the next 10 years?
That's pretty difficult to assess. Yeah, I think we should be worried about it for sure. I don't know, we have to panic directly because there is still so much unknown. For instance, it's very difficult to quantify how resilient our forest is, but it's definitely something that we should throw some scientific brains at to see what is actually happening. Small changes can actually cause runaway effects or not, because that is something we do not know. Are these lianas going to create a kind of a runaway effect? Because if that is true, then we should be very worried. If not, if it's a response, just a response of the forest, yeah, then a little bit less. So if I have to scale it up from 0 to 5 of all the problems in the world, I would say maybe three, 3.5. Yeah.
Yeah, on a more bright side, positive note, so what's something that a regular person who's not a scientist or a politician or a policymaker or whatever can actually do that would make a real difference, not only for the tropical forests, but for the climate in general?
Yes, great. And there's many things that we as humans can do. Is one of the things that I think is very important is we find a bit of grounding with nature. I feel that a lot of people have lost the connection with nature. So go on a walk, explore and enjoy the forest. It doesn't feel like a lot, but I think it would be wonderful to see the beauty, because once you realize something is interesting and fascinating, you would be more inclined to protect it. And so here, for instance, watchers in the US, what you could do with relation to lianas is go to your local forest and help out to remove the invasive and very aggressive liana species. And also be aware that there is also a lot of positive and native lianas that definitely deserve a bit more attention and a bit more passion from a lot of the forest dwellers. Yeah. And
Yeah.
of course, stay informed. Very important. Just, yeah, stay informed and see what's out there.
Yeah, so who are one or two scientists that you think I should interview after you?
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research that is going on everywhere. But For this question, I actually came quite prepared. I've been reading a couple of books and I was thinking also of the positive aspects for some of the listeners. And I thought this book by Douglas Tallamy on Nature's Best Hope would be, for instance, a great person to interview because he brings often like a very practical way of how we can do small things in our garden that can actually help our biodiversity. And another person, a researcher that I thought was pretty fascinating is Scott Mainers. He also wrote a book that's Tree by Tree. It's about different diseases that impacted our forests here in the US.
Mhm.
For instance, yeah, pests that destroyed a lot of very important trees here in the US, like the chestnut, for instance. So I thought those were, if you can get a hold on them, these would be very interesting people to talk to.
Yeah, so I have one final question. I've heard a lot of different answers to this. I ask basically every scientist that I interview this question, and it's quite simple. If every teenager on Earth were to hear one last sentence from you, it can be climate, Liana related, whatever you, what would it be?
Yeah, we can go very philosophical, and this is quite difficult. But if I think of it, one of the things that I would recommend for young scientists or teenagers in general is just to not be afraid to venture into the unknown, just to explore, follow your gut feeling. Out of my experience myself, sometimes to go outside of your comfort zone. For instance, I moved to another country. I explored an entire different ecosystem that I'm used to, and going into the tropics without that much knowledge at that point about the tropics or what I was starting at. And these are experiences that are very valuable. They enrich me as a person and as a scientist. And I think if you can just dare to explore and do not be afraid too much to fail and learn from those failures, that I think would be not only from a scientific perspective, but as a human, I think it will strengthen you. So I think that would be my message.